Good evening and Wanzhen Hao. First of all, I'd like to wish you all a Happy New Year's in two cultures. A late Happy New Year's for the Canadian calendar, the Gregorian calendar, and in advance, Happy Year of the Pig in the Chinese agricultural calendar. My name is John Gretzner. I'm one of the 24 founders and of the China Policy Center, which is a not-for-profit, member-driven organization. Now my role is to be the chief fundraiser. I have Susan Gregson here as one of our board members, who will be speaking later on with Christoph. The goal of the center, and I'll be brief because I know we have some more in-depth, more interesting topics to get to in terms of the first report that we funded. We are a non-partisan, fact-driven organization that simply believes that with better understanding of China, that China, the world, and Canada benefits. We have, learning from the Chinese expression, we are seeking not the truth from the facts, but we're seeking the facts from the facts. And we are kind enough to be here because, and I think probably the first person I would thank would be Catherine Lister Hayes. Out of the blue, 3 years ago, I wrote her and said, I'm coming to Ottawa and I'd like to be a part of your university. And we've gone through a very detailed, engaged process with a number of the faculty, and I can't thank everybody by name because we don't have that much time. But I really do appreciate the support that the University of Ottawa has given to our center, and we will be expanding our activities as we grow. And we're learning from China with a 5-year plan and have a number of activities that we hope to expand on. So I think that's important from my point of view, that we understand why we're here. I think that we're in a period where, if you've read 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, as a community on this planet, we're facing 3 problems, according to Harari: the implications of climate change, the implications of the growth of humanity, and I think even our own ability to be humans confronted with technology. And our goal is to improve the dialogue and improve the understanding by bringing out information so that people have a better understanding, certainly what's going on in China, and they can do with what they choose with that information to make their own decisions. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be able to present Christoph Zürcher, who's a full professor at the Public International Affairs Faculty of Social Sciences here at the University of Ottawa. He's been diligently working for almost probably over a year, traveling to China and also to the United States, to the UN, and doing a large amount of work here at the university to present the first report that we have cooperated with as an organization. And it's about appropriate because China is coming up to its 30th anniversary of its participation in peacekeeping. And I will let the experts speak. And thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the report. And Christoph, thank you.
Thank you, and welcome. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about 30 years of Chinese peacekeeping. And I should also start with quite a few thank yous. So thank you to John as one of the founders of that center and for funding for the report, and Susan Gregson is on the board of the center and has supported me in that research. I should thank CIPS, the Center for International Policy, also for co-funding the report and for hosting this event. Stephanie Plank is instrumental in all of this. Thank you. Then I should thank Ruth Brandon Sincere for excellent editing. Nosheen Ahmad for the layouting, and my excellent research assistants, Michaela Bell and Minggu Wang, who is probably not here yet. I should also thank many, many more people who talked to me, but everybody I interviewed for the report, we did that specifically not for attribution. So you won't find the names in the report, and I'm not going to mention names, but there were tons of people who shared time and insights with me. And then I should thank, lastly, the 3 peer reviewers for that report. 4, actually. We had Professor Song Fang from Rice University, Lu Tieva from Beijing Foreign Studies University, Lance Noble, and finally Michael Corley, who is still detained in China, and obviously we hope that he will be released very soon. So, that's the plan. By the way, the report is downloadable as of today. We're going to show that URL later on, so you can download the full report. That's the plan of today. There's one item missing, and this is the comments by Susan Gregson to what I have to say. And she is the China expert. I'm not. I know a bit about peacekeeping, peacebuilding, United Nations. I'm not a China expert. She is, so I look forward to the comments. That's the plan. I'm going to start with a very short overview of what China does today, and it's remarkable what China does today in peacekeeping. Followed by a very brief history of the evolution of Chinese peacekeeping. Then we're going to talk about the motivation. We want to talk about the evolution of the UN peacekeeping and the reaction of China. Then an outlook to the future, Q&A, and then a reception. That is the plan. Before I start, the one thing I have learned, I've learned so many things during that year working on that, but one thing I also have learned is that not being a China expert at all, right, the world of China watchers is, you know, there's 2 camps, the panda huggers and the dragon slayers. So for the panda huggers, everything that comes out of China is good. For the dragon slayers, everything is sinister. And I found it interesting that even for me as an outsider to the field, it was kind of difficult to navigate that field, because sooner or later, you know, you're confronted with that question on which camp you are in. And I'm not in any camp. What I try to do is to produce a report which is based on fact, as evidence-based, and as candid but also thorough research as I could. I have to say that I find the panda cute. So today, China has it's amazing what China does in the field of peacekeeping. It's also amazing that we know so little about it, right? That was back in '71 when China became a member of the United Nations. That was very, very different. So for the first 10 years or so, China rejected any kind of international peacekeeping. It thought it was a thinly veiled disguise for international inventivism by the big power, imperialism, and it mainly abstained from any vote, right? Today, 30 years later, fast forward to 30 years later, I would say China is a leader in international peacekeeping. I'm just going to give you a few facts to highlight the important contributions. First is it has over 2,500 peacekeepers in the field. So that is by far the largest contribution of all the members of the Permanent Five in the Security Council. It is also the one country which is both a member of the Security Council and a large troop contributor. Usually there's in the United Nations peacekeeping, there's a division of labor, those who pay and make decisions and those who send the people with the guns, the equipment. China is an exception. It is a P5 member and it has 2,500 people in the field. I think Canada has 177 as we speak. So it just shows you in numbers how important China has become. But it's not only numbers, right? It's only that, well, there's also numbers, but it's only, so the peacekeepers in the field, it's the financial contribution, which is, I think, 10-point-something% of the annual peacekeeping budget, which is the second largest contributor to UN peacekeeping. It contributes, it sends personnel into the field to, as we speak, I think 9 missions, but among them the big 5, the most difficult ones, like Mali, Sudan, DR Congo, Central African Republic, and Darfur. So it is not picky, it goes there where it hurts, right? It has also completed the registration of an 8,000 strong force, of a UN reaction force, so at the disposal of the UN, which consists, among others, things of 6 infantry battalions, and a lot of those high technical enabling units, such as 3 companies of engineers, transport companies, field hospitals, security companies, drones, helicopters. So it's not only the mass of people it sends, it's also that it sends it has at least for the UN, it provides these highly technical and highly trained enabling units. Right? It has built up over the last 2 decades training centers, one for the military peacekeepers and one for the police peacekeepers, and to all the people I talk to within the UN. Sometimes also people who went to these peacebuilding centers, they all report that the quality is very high and it's absolutely in line with the UN standard. So it's not a different thing. It's within UN standards. Right? It has committed $100 million to the African Union to build up the African Union's capacity for peacebuilding, which is also in line with the UN thinking that the UN wants to empower, to a certain extent, regional organizations to make them part of the peacebuilding architecture. It has contributed $200 million to the United Nations Peace and Development Fund, which is funding initiatives and research. So one of the concept papers that came out of this research fund was the so-called Cruise report, which some of you might have heard, and I'm going to talk about the Cruise report in a minute. And then lastly, it's not about these numbers only, but when I did my interviews at the UN, with the UN, one thing that came very strongly across is that everybody is impressed by how serious China takes learning. There's a clear commitment to learning, to bring up the standards, to send well-equipped and well-trained troops to get better at peacekeeping. So that is just an amazing evolution from in the late 70s, peacekeeping is bad, it's imperialist, to 2018, where China is one of the leading nations in peacekeeping. So how, and you see that in that graph, you see this evolution. So the blue line is the Chinese personnel, the red line is the UN personnel. Obviously, the measurements are different, so that we could squeeze it in one graph. But you see the evolution starting from very low levels, and then around 2004, the numbers are exploding. Right? So that's the evolution we're talking about. So there's 4 phases. I'm going to very quickly through these 4 phases. That's kind of a historical narrative. So the first phase in the evolution of Chinese peacekeeping, roughly from 1981 to 1988, that's a very, very cautious phase. That's the early phase of Chinese peacekeeping, which mainly consists of watching, not reacting, being very cautious, and abstaining. So it didn't veto, China didn't veto, at least not many peacekeeping missions, mostly abstain, but it did also not participate. What it did during that phase was develop a sort of a doctrine of Chinese peacekeeping, which is to some extent still fundamental for Chinese thinking on peacekeeping. So that, if you want to call it doctrine, it consists of, yes, we do support peacekeeping, right? But peacekeeping should only be launched with the consent of the target states. That's one of the core tenets, which to some extent is in contradiction to some of the missions on the Chapter 7. So consent is important, right? The independence, sovereignty, and integrity of the state should be respected. That's the sovereignty doctrine. The use of force should be avoided. That's also then a constant recurring theme, the use of force, which always is difficult to do in Mali, right? It was easier in Cyprus. I'll get back to that, right? and the primacy of politics, which is also a recurring theme. So these elements were formulated in an early phase. Then we move in the second stage, which is 89 to 1998. That is also a phase where UN peacekeeping gets more complicated. So the easy successes are over, and the complicated cases are setting in. China votes in favor of most UN peacekeeping missions during that time, and it develops its first ever mission, first a civilian mission. It deploys its first civilian mission to Namibia. So civilian observers to UNTAG for the mission that overlooked the transition to Namibia's independence in late '89. And then a little bit later, they sent the first, this time military personnel into the field, this time to the mission in the Middle East. It continues to believe very strongly that peacekeeping should be, require the host nation's consent, should be respectful of the sovereignty, but it starts to participate in peacekeeping. Then we move to the third phase, 1999 to 2003. It still doesn't deploy security troops or combat troops. It still deploys mainly engineering troops and medical troops. But it does participate during that phase in most of the now very complicated peace-building missions. So we have chapter 7 missions, these multi-dimensional, very complicated missions, which are way more complicated, for example, CIPS. And then the fourth phase starts 2004, and that's still ongoing. That's where you see the number exploding. Not only the Chinese numbers, but you see also the UN numbers. That's when the UN is starting to really, getting a lot of work in a more unstable, more difficult, more dangerous world. And that phase begins by sending 600 people to Liberia. So that's the largest contingent that China has ever sent during that period. And there's also change. China had kept a very low profile in peacekeeping. So it went with the UN in different phases before, but it kept a very low profile. That is also changing a little bit because China, for the first time, is also using its diplomatic means to convince the president of Sudan to actually allow a peace-building mission. So it uses for the first time also diplomatic means. So that's in a nutshell the trajectory. Now, what is the motivation for such an involvement? That's an interesting question. It's probably the question that has, if you read the academic literature, that's the question that are most people fascinated. So why would China invest in such a massive build-up of peacekeeping capabilities and capacities? And there's obviously more than one answer, so it's not only one factor that explains it. And obviously the factors change over the last 3 or 4 decades, so it's not every factor at the same time has the same importance. A few factors stand out, though. And I'll probably start with the last one, which does not apply. So one of the motivation that they are suspected very often, that I hear very often, that also you read very often, is that China's participation in peacekeeping, especially in Africa, has to a large extent to do something with the economic interests in Africa. It's connected to the resources. It sends troops there where it has an economic interest. That would be mainly natural resources and oil. But that's an argument that just doesn't bear out. There's very, very poor evidence for that. If you look at the numbers, you see that 80% of the UN personnel, of the total UN personnel, is deployed in Africa because the big 5 missions are in Africa. The same percentage goes for China. 80% of China's deployment is in Africa. So there's a high congruence between where the UN needs troops and where Chinese troops are being sent to. You would also see that the ratio of Chinese troops in resource-rich countries compared to resource-poor countries, they are the same. So it's not that all all the resource-rich countries get a Chinese peacekeeping convention and the resource do not. So that's just a non-starter. It doesn't bear out. What works, well, what is important is probably the first and the third argument, maybe the most important one. So one is reputational gains. And yes, the reputational gain and kind of the branding is very important as an explanation. So what was important was here is the phrase responsible power, which was very often used by China in the Chinese narratives since the 1990s to denote that China had not only become an economic power, but also intended to use its growing power to contribute to peace, security, and global governance by being a responsible power, so by taking its responsibility as a peer of the other big powers. There's one quotation here by the Chief of General Staff of the People's Liberation Army. It kind of summarizes it. So the quotation goes like this: China is a peace-loving country, and in addressing grave issues involving peace and security, we are a responsible country. Chinese peacekeeping activities demonstrate our country's image as a responsible superpower. And that's, in a way, that's the argument here, right? It's the branding as a responsible power, the reputational gains and the image. And this narrative has then developed. It's responsible power, and then that later on, very soon, there's the concept of the peaceful rise, which means that in order to continue its economic rise, China needs a peaceful, stable global environment, and one way to contribute to that would be by branding itself as a responsible superpower that actually contributes to peace. Right? Then we have the concept of harmonious world, and then later on the concept of the community of shared futures. So that's one broad narrative that is designed to project an image as a responsible power, but also as a power which is at the same level as the other powers, right? So it's also a self-image as a peer of the superpower. So that's one very, I think, very important motivation. The narrative, the branding, the self-image, and the generation of social capital. Right? Another one is also being perceived as a champion for the developing world. So China is a unique case in the Security Council, the permanent members, because it is both a member of the Security Council, but it's also a leader of the developing world, of the so-called third world. So it has these two positions, and it likes to be perceived as as one of the leaders of the developing world. And by contributing to peacekeeping, the hope is that would support that narrative as a champion of the third world. An argument which is also often made is operation exposure for the PLA. That is to some extent true. I do not think that alone that would be strong enough, powerful enough to explain anything. So I don't think that the army would be able to kind of hijack political decisions. But it's true that as a side effect, it's a very welcome side effect to test new communication system, and probably especially to train and practice how to operate with other units and how to learn from other units, or how to learn from Western countries, but also how to project power for a long distance from China to Mali, from China to Sudan. So that is a part of an argument. I think it's the main argument, right? The last one, I think it's also important. I do think that by investing in the United Nations, and the most important task and the most noble task of the United Nations is peacekeeping. It is about peace, right? So by supporting the only body that is a platform for the world to speak to each other and to promote peace, by supporting that organization, that institution, it does strengthen multilateralism, which is also a way to prevent that unilateralism evolves, which means the dominance of the US. Right? So by strengthening multilateralism, this world vision which is not unilateral. And there were some instances in the history of Chinese peacekeeping where you could see this very, very clearly. For example, after the crisis in Kosovo, I'll talk about this in a minute. So I think that sums it up, the most important motivational structures. What I found most interesting is really that the last argument, economic profits, really doesn't work. It doesn't explain anything. So far, I have been talking from a Chinese perspective, the four phases and the motivation. We could tell the whole story from the UN perspective. Right? So, what has the UN done? How has UN peacekeeping evolved, and how did China react to these evolutions of peacekeeping? It is very clear, very evident that UN peacekeeping over the last 3 decades has evolved. It has changed dramatically, right? If you want to visualize that, you could think about CIPS, which was a mission, still is a mission, where the task of the mission basically is to check once in the morning and once in the evening whether the sandbags are in a move and the trenches are still the same, and that's it, right? And then the other vision, the other visualization is Mali, which is a total mess. There's so many armed non-government actors are active. It's unclear whether the government is actually partnered or is part of the problem. It is unclear how the mission could fulfill its mandate. It is unclear what the boundaries are between protecting UN peacekeepers, protecting the mandate, or doing counterinsurgency. So it's a whole different world between Cyprus and Mali. And I don't want to tell it in a chronological way, but these, in a way, are the most important milestones, right, over the last 3 decades. So one is a turn to more robust peacekeeping. And then we have R2P, which you probably know, it's a Canadian invention. It's the responsibility to protect, which means that if a country is unwilling or unable to protect its own citizens, then that responsibility is transferred to the international community, and that gives the international community the moral right to intervene. Right? Then we have POC, which is another concept. That's the protection of civilians. It's linked to POC, but it's different. I'll talk about it in a second. Then we have the issue of self-protection of UN peacekeepers. We have the issue of how to empower regional organizations so that become a part of the UN peacekeeping system. And we have the issue of kind of a peacekeeping fatigue. So these are the milestones of the last 3 decades. The first one is the robust peacekeeping, which is probably linked to the famous Brahimi report in the late 90s. The Brahimi report was a high-level panel that should investigate why UN peacekeeping was not as effective as it could have been. The backdrop here is obviously the failures in Sudan, and then the tragedies in Rwanda, the tragedy in Bosnia, where the UN peacekeeping was not prepared to prevent genocide. So that triggered the whole review process. The Brahimi report came out. There's two really important implications from that. One is the Brahimi report called for a more forceful posture of UN peacekeeping. So more force, more active soldiering, a more robust posture, probably more militarized, which is obviously a very, very slippery road, right? I mean, you can understand why the Brahimi report came to that conclusion, but it's also a very slippery road, because if you go that road, then, as we see in Mali, the boundaries between peacekeeping and counterinsurgency. No one in the UN would use that word, but it's a fact that in Mali there's the problem of where does protection of the mandate stop and where does counterinsurgency begin. So that's one legacy of the Brahimi report. The other one is protection of civilians. against the backdrop of Bosnia and Rwanda, it became extremely important and clear that the number one objective for UN peacekeeping would have to be protection of the civilians. So that's that term we wrote with peacekeeping. Then we have R2P, and that's the one norm that, by and large, China went in the past. By and large, China went in step with all of the terms that the UN took. Right? It followed suit. R2P is different. R2P was discussed as a norm that would empower the international community to intervene, and that triggered a lot of resistance. Within China, within Russia, within developing countries, there was the very reasonable concern that R2P could become a pretext for intervention by the strong powers in weak countries. Nevertheless, in 2005, R2P was approved by the countries, by most countries, including China, and it was approved because, in the end, R2P was brought back under the authority of the Security Council. So in the end it was approved. It meant that R2P could be invoked, but it could only be invoked by the Security Council. In case the Security Council was blocked, then no R2P. And that helped China to accept that. The norm was still there, and the first time it was invoked was also the last time. There was Libya, and Libya was a huge disappointment for the Chinese. It was after the Arab Spring in 2011 when the international community launched an intervention in Libya. It was branded as a humanitarian intervention. In the views of China, it turned very quickly into an intervention which was aimed at changing the regime by violent means. So exactly what China and Russia and lots of other developed countries had feared. And that was the moment when R2P was dead, for the Chinese, for the Russians, and for many other countries. And now these days in the UN, R2P is a word that no one really uses. It's now POC, protection of civilians, which has become a major part of every mandate of United Nations peacekeeping. So our POC is important. And POC is much more acceptable for China because it does not involve the undermining of state sovereignty. It does not involve a norm that says you can interfere if you do not do this or that. And it also places the first responsibility for the protection of civilians with the host country, and only then with the UN nations. So on a conceptual level, POC is acceptable, right? On the practical level, it's a very, very thorny issue. How do you protect civilians in a country like Sudan? How do you do that, right? One way is, as in Sudan, that's another good way, is you have massive IDP refugee camps, which are basically guarded by the UN. So the UN does, what the UN mainly does is guard tens of thousands of refugees in camps. That's one way. Another way would be to proactively go after those people who would harm civilians. If you want to do that, that requires that you have the capabilities to be very, very fast and mobile. So airlifting capabilities, for example. And you would have to think very carefully when to use violence. So on a conceptual level, POC is okay for the Chinese. On a practical level, it's an open question for China and for everyone else. How do we do that? Right? So this is kind of the evolution, and in a nutshell, as I said before, China has followed most of the terms of the UN. Right? It has been a good citizen of UN peacekeeping, with the exception of responsibility to protect, and with the caution and the concerns for the use of force. But these concerns are shared by many other members. Right? Now, the future of Chinese Now there's one thing I should mention before. So the last thing, the last doctrinal innovation in UN peacekeeping is the action for peacekeeping, A4P. That is a recent initiative by the Secretary General. It is an exercise in mobilizing support for UN peacekeeping. So there's the fatigue, the peacekeeping fatigue, and the Secretary General came up with an initiative to relaunch the engagement of donors for peacekeeping, and also to maybe to recalibrate UN peacekeeping, which has become in the eyes of many too militarized and less focused on political solutions. So the UN came up with a declaration, the UN declaration, the action for peacekeeping, A4P, which was in late 2018 approved by all the member states. And it is worth quickly looking at that, because we see, I think, a new facet in China's approach to UN peacekeeping. So the wording of that declaration, it's a valid document, right? It's a declaration that should mobilize the support of the international community for more peacekeeping. And the Chinese have approved that, as many other countries also did. And in the endorsement letter, in the Chinese endorsement letter for that declaration, they used the opportunity to signal what is effective from a Chinese point of view in peacekeeping. And in a way, it's only 4 or 5 paragraphs, but it shows, I think it shows in a nutshell the conceptual thinking of China with regard to peacekeeping. I think it's quite interesting. The first 4 points, as we talked about that already, it is largely unchanged from before. Right? First, the UN Charter, and by that they mean respect for equality, multilateralism, respect for sovereignty. That's a common thread, right? The second one, political solutions. China has always advocated that use of force is the last resort. Political solutions, negotiation, mediation should be much more important. That was also a common thread. That's nothing new. Right? Third, mandate by the Security Council basically means don't ever think about doing R2P again. It has to go through the Security Council. That's the only accepted authority. And many countries would agree with that. Right? Fourth one, strong partnership. That is a nod to the African Union and probably other regional organizations as possible partners in peacekeeping. That's another theme of Chinese peacekeeping, to empower those partners. What is really important and interesting is the fifth, peacebuilding. Because until 2018 in November, China has never really used the word peacebuilding. They have used peacekeeping, which is a technical activity. Right? You go in between the voting parties. Peacebuilding is much more complex, it's much more political, it's much more encompassing, right? And it's much more interfering, because if you want to build peace, you have to go in a country and change incentives. So China has always abstained from using that terminology, never talked about peace building. And now in November 2018 they do. Right? And in a nutshell, you see what peace building here is. Right? It's a natural next step of peacekeeping. Right? And peacekeepers should contribute to local capacity building, thus laying the foundation for poverty alleviation, sustainable development, and enduring peace. So that's the logical concept of a Chinese approach. Go there, increase capacities, which means state capacity. So build a strong state. From a strong state, what follows is mainly economic development, and economic development leads to peace, right? And that's a very different approach from the so-called liberal peace approach, which is probably a blueprint in the West, right? So here is strong government, it's economic development, and then peace. In a Western liberal approach, it's transition to democracy, minority rights, good governance, democracy. So we see in a nutshell an emerging concept of a thinking, theoretical thinking, and I think that's very interesting. My last section is about the future of Chinese peacekeeping. And there's a couple of things which we know, even though we don't have crystal balls. But one thing which we know is that it is very unlikely that China will reduce in the foreseeable future its commitment to peacekeeping. It's unlikely. There's too much investment, too much money, too much infrastructure, too much goodwill, too much social capital. So we will see the same or even increased commitment by China. Linked to that, China's role will also increase because at the same time, other peacekeepers are slowly moving out of peacekeeping. They're unwilling, they lack the political will to really support peacekeeping. And the UN has always had, but even more so today, massive problems in getting the finances for the peacekeeping mission. So by default, as the US and other countries are pulling out, in terms of money, right, but also in terms of contributions, China's weight will increase. Lots of important decisions in the UN are taken through the budgetary process. So it's just a given, right? It's natural that China gets more weight in the budgetary process, which means more political influence, which also means that it's not a secret that it's very likely that there's an aspiration to get the position of the Undersecretary for Peacekeeping in the next term. What is, for me, the most interesting question is not if, but when China's weight in the UN will increase. Right? Will that also lead to China trying to influence, in conceptual terms, the concept of peacekeeping? Will they try to steer peacekeeping in a new direction? Because so far they didn't, right? It was good citizens of the UN. Right? And there's at least two signals that point to a certain direction. One signal is that during the last budgetary negotiations within the UN, and that happened in a situation when there was a lot of pressure to cut the budget. In this situation, maybe Russia, but also China, tried to cut many positions within United Nations peacekeeping missions that refer to human rights. You probably know that in peacekeeping missions, there's a number of positions that are devoted to human rights. So these positions, they monitor the host country, and there was a very consistent effort to claw back these positions. In the end, it failed. So I think there were 50 positions were said to not be filled or abolished. In the end, all but 3 were filled in. So in the end, the countries who were interested in these positions found the money. But it was a very consistent approach. And that comes at a time where also for the first time, China has launched a couple of resolutions in the United Nations Human Rights Council. Right? And one of these resolutions referred to was a resolution called the contribution of development to the enjoyment of human rights. And that is interesting because it very clearly puts forward a Chinese conception of human rights, which is opposed to a Western conception of human rights. So in a Western conception, they would say is it's individualistic rights. It's right-based, it's political and civil liberty, and that's what's important. In the Chinese concept, and some very smart academics did a lot of content analysis, so I'm drawing on their work. The Chinese concept is based on collective rights. It's very closely linked to economic rights, to the right to development, to economic benefits, right, to basic services. And the provision of these basic services is then very closely tied to a strong state. So in that concept, right, human right basically means the enjoyment of development rights, of economic rights, of basic needs being covered by a very strong state. So that's a very different concept. And it's interesting that these concepts are now being slowly inserted in UN discussion. Before that, in UN peacekeeping, human rights was not in it. It was an issue between Russia, between China and the West, but not in peacekeeping terms. Right? So that's one thing. And the other thing is, and I've quickly talked about that, is the concept of the developmental peace, as opposed to our liberal, or the Western concept of liberal peace, right? You saw it a little bit here in the endorsement letter, right, where we had this the conceptual thinking. It's much more articulated in the thinking of some of the Chinese intellectuals, academics, and the notion goes something like that. So the blueprint according to which the UN works is the liberal peace, and the liberal peace means we have to bring, in order to end violence, right? The best bulwark against violence is good governance. It's a swift transition to democracy. It's a strong civil society. It's political civil rights, protection of minority rights, and all of this, in a Chinese view, is imposed. And there's something to it, because many of these, of these policies are they're conditioned. There's conditionality in it, right? So the counter position, which is now being formulated by Chinese scholars and academics, this is kind of developmental peace or developmental liberal peace. So it's not good government, it's effective government. It's incremental change as opposed to the very swift transition change, and in Chinese view, very swift breakthrough to democracy is destabilizing, this destabilizing effect, which is undoubtedly true. Right? The primacy of economic development and a very strong emphasis on endogenous learning as opposed to imposing. I should say that these are kind of ideal positions in a way. There's lots of critique in the West on the liberal peace, so that needs to be said. And it also needs to be said that the developmental peace is not yet a fully developed theory, and it hasn't been tried in practice. How would it look like in a country like Mali, where you don't have a foundation to build a strong government, right? Where you have so many warring parties, where you have massive problems with minorities. So how this would look like in practice is still an open question. But I do think that this is one of the most fascinating topics going forward, and a topic which is certainly worth, in my view, discussing. With that, I end. Thank you for your attention, and I will hand over to Susan for comments. Thank you, Susan.
So thanks very much, Christoph, and congratulations on your work on this paper. I think you've broken a lot of ground here, and I think there's a lot of very interesting issues that you've brought forward. You've introduced me as a China expert. I would call myself rather a long-term observer of China. I was a Canada-China scholar in 78-80, and so I've had the opportunity to observe China's rise, and particularly through reform and opening up over the last 40-odd years. And so I've also observed the evolution that you described, Christoph, in terms of the Chinese engagement with the multilateral world in terms of, first of all, being very non-interventionist and now moving towards more active participation. You talked about peacekeeping and the reluctance to take on that leadership role in the multilateral world. And we've been hearing a lot about China and Belt and Road, and we've been hearing a lot about China's economic development and its view of development in the world. But it's very interesting to see that through the peacekeeping lens. So this is kind of a different approach, and one that I think is really worthwhile pursuing. You mentioned China as a champion for the developing world. And I wonder what it is about, and maybe you could comment on this a little bit later, what about China's role and behavior as peacekeepers? What does this do to establish their reputation? So how are they sort of living, taking up this role and living that role? I think we all have seen that in some circles, the UN's reputation has become maybe a bit tarnished. It doesn't enjoy the same full support that it once did. There's been a lot of criticism, particularly by our neighbors south of the border. And so I wonder how, if at all, China's peacekeeping role supports the UN's reputation and bolsters its reputation and its actions in the world. Wonder also how the Chinese view on peace building and accords with the lack of their community outreach that you observed in your report. So if you read, which I encourage you all to do, to read Christoph's report, he does make mention of China not having as much community outreach while conducting their peacekeeping activities as perhaps some other Western countries have been doing. So where is all of this going? How do we see this in terms of international approaches to development assistance, and will this have an impact? Interesting, your closing comments I thought were very interesting with regard to China's behavior in the Human Rights Council and the resolutions that they put forward with regard to economic development and economic rights. And that's certainly, in my own experience in discussing human rights with Chinese interlocutors, that's certainly an issue that comes up, and it certainly reflects China's own rise in terms of providing more economic benefits to its own citizens and its economic growth. So I think this is a very, the fact that in their view, economic development requires a strong state, that this is going to, how will this influence going forward UN discussions on peacekeeping, and what kind of impact is that going to have? So I think what I gathered from your, very briefly, what I gathered from your paper and from your lecture today is that we are looking at a very different world in peacekeeping. We're looking at a world where we've got a lot more, China has really been stepping up to take on its responsibility as a global leader, as certainly a global economic leader, but now we see China stepping up to be a global leader in terms of maintaining peace around the world and taking up its international role. So with that, let me once again congratulate you on this important work, and I think we have some time for questions and discussions with our audience. So once again, thank you very much, Christoph.
Thank you.
How do you want to do this? Do you want to come back up and I'll field the questions, or do you want to just take them on your own?
I can take it for now, but there might be questions to you. Right? So just, if you want to briefly introduce you, mention your name, and let me know whether the question is from me or from Susan. And we'll try to do our best.
Questions?
Thanks. Jerry Wright from the Canadian International Council and the Patterson School. I was most interested in your whole discussion, but in particular, I wondered whether there's any parallel to the Canadian experience insofar as ever since we got into peacekeeping, or almost ever since then, we have been trying to get other countries involved. And there's always been, I think, a certain nervousness that we would be too out front, too committed, and that we wouldn't be bringing others along to share the burden. And at one time, of course, we did play a much bigger role than we have in recent years. And we were worried about getting stuck in CIPS, for example, and we were there for a very long time until we finally settled out. The Chinese, is their commitment to this subject such that they are trying to proselytize for it in other governments? Are they attempting to recruit other countries to emulate them?
Thank you. That is there's an easy answer to that, no. So I like the question because it's an easy answer, no. And the reason for this is that it was always difficult over the last, it's even more difficult now for China to balance, on the one hand, to actually contribute to peacekeeping and to rise up to the self-image as a responsible power who does something, and on the other hand, not to fuel the narrative of the China threat. So it was always, they always tried to keep a very deliberately, a very, very low profile. I'm not sure whether that is changing now. Yeah, the next 3, 4, 5 years will tell us more. But until now, the answer is clearly no. China has always operated to the large extent under the radar and trying not to fuel the this is all the narratives about China threat. So no.
Anyone else?
My name is Nelson Mahmoudi. I'm a first-year student here in political science and common law. My question is, as of right now, there is only currently one offensive unit with the United Nations Peacekeeping and either 14 missions. That is the Tanzanian unit in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Do you feel through your research that the United Nations will try to create more of these offensive units? And if so, could China step into that role to create one of these units? Thank you.
I think there's more. I mean, if you also look at the mission in DR Congo, where the UN had a very, very robust posture, I think there's more. And very often it's also difficult to make the clear distinction between what is what is purely defensive and is offensive. So I think there's more. I do not think, I'm actually convinced that China will do everything it can to avoid being perceived as a country that that provides the military muscle to the UN peacekeeping. That can be clearly seen, for example, in Mali, where they caution, pretty happy that the French, not the French UN peacekeepers, but the French army is the heavy lifting. So no, I don't think that anytime soon we will see a more robust or more aggressive approach by the Chinese peacekeepers. To the contrary, I think their political line is still very clear, and that is, if at all possible, primacy of political solution counts. And they did like the Cruz report, for example, which advocated for a more robust posture. They're extremely cautious. They always point out to the dangers that there's, the boundaries between defending the mandate and counterinsurgency. That's a real danger. So the answer is I don't think it's going to happen.
Hello, my name is Mada. I'm a previous UN staffer and a member of the Women, Peace and Security Network in Canada. Regarding a small comment and a brief question. For my comment, I'm a bit allergic to the term the Arab Spring that you used. And I think it was more worse than a Canadian winter, I'd say, than an Arab Spring. In terms of the question, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting, and I would love to read the paper if we have access to it. My question is, has China been able to select or influence the countries that they do peacekeeping in, or were they more abiding by what the UN asks for?
The latter, clearly the latter. And the UN is actually very grateful to that. So one thing that I heard all the time in New York is that China is one of the few countries that, how it works the fourth generation. So there's a unit within the UN that is the fourth generation. And it basically has a roster of countries that said we will support peacekeeping missions by pledging this and this and this and this unit. So the engineers and the hospital and whatever it is, right? And then nations can put some caveats on that and say we will pledge this, but not for this region, not for this country. And according to the fourth generation unit, the Chinese pledges come with very, very few caveats. That means if the UN asks them to go to Mali, they go to Mali most of the time.
And I arrived a bit late, so thank you for this. I apologize. I remember.
Une question?
Nipa Banerjee, I'm with Ottawa University with CIPS and I'm a senior fellow. I wanted to ask you mentioned that that the UN talks about, it's not only numbers, but the UN talks about that they are being very effective. What did you find or did you look into if the Chinese peace building efforts in capacity building that you have mentioned several times, how it is going? Have you looked at it, or you just talked to the UN and you think they're effective?
It's very, very difficult to. It's extremely difficult. I mean, in the context of UN peacekeeping, it's extremely difficult to have a clear sense of which national contingent has what kind of an impact. So it's a joint mission. It could be 12,000 soldiers. And of these 12,700 are Chinese, and they are engineers and the medical hospital. So it is extremely difficult to pinpoint whether there's a specific Chinese effect on something. So the answer is I don't know, but I would think that in general it's a collective effort. So it's the mission, it's not the national contingent. What I hear is, when you zoom in on that question, what I hear is that the Chinese style as peacekeeper is still relatively they keep to themselves, not too much interaction with the local communities, not very proactive, always by the book. So when there's the rule of engagement by the UN, they play by the book, but kind of not outgoing in a way. But this is all anecdotal evidence, but it's very, very difficult to pinpoint that to real effect.
I just have a comment on the developmental peace concept. It is very interesting, and I hope that there will be more discussions and research on that. I find that some of the developing countries that are emerging, India for instance, believes in that as well. I've had some discussions and they believe in it, so that will be very interesting to pursue in our research.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one of the topics. I agree.
Super. Is there d'autres questions? More questions?
Hi, Igor Safarins. Just curious if you have any thoughts on the apparent, to me, is a contradiction in the fact that China, on the one hand, supports multilateralism through participation in the UN, and on the other, does things like violate UN CLOS rulings.
Sorry, violate what?
UN CLOS laws of the sea. South China Sea, for example. Is that? Just any comments on that?
The one comment I have is that the two things are really detached in a way. You do not understand Chinese peacekeeping by studying their Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, and vice versa. So it's entirely possible to be, within the realm of peacekeeping, to play by the rules, and then we see the domestic affairs to play by another set of rules. And it's possible, it's probably happening, but you cannot predict the future, Chinese future behavior by looking at the South China Sea for peacekeeping or vice versa. It's really, it is two different playgrounds in a way. But it's really interesting what you're asking, because that's so often I was sitting in interviews and I was reading things, and very often that's kind of the Western approach to Chinese peacekeeping. So, I want to ask about peacekeeping, but I'm going to start with the South China Sea. That in a way is also, to some extent, a non-starter, because it's really two different things.
I think it just plays an interesting part in words versus actions. Well, UN is obviously actions too, so it definitely is worth something, but they contradict. But I understand what you're saying. It's two different playgrounds.
It also depends on your narrative, right? I mean, there's a Chinese narrative about the South China Sea, which says it's different. Right?
My question, Christoph, is if you look at Mali, which has the second highest birth rate in the world, is China's participation, especially in the medical field, giving any specific attention to family planning?
No, I would doubt that very much. From what I hear, I don't think China is there, and that would mean that would mean that a country has a kind of a coherent, holistic approach to peace building. And then one part would be we're sending our peacekeepers. Another part would be we have a development mission. We have a development vision for that country, and then we support that with development projects. I don't think China does that. They were keeping out of this kind of peace building. That is why I thought this is so interesting. This letter of endorsement for the first time they talk about that. So we may see that in the future, but for now it's really if China has a hospital there, it's a hospital for the UN, and it will live up to the highest UN standards. But that's about it. Right? And another thing which also comes, that's still anecdotal, but that would also, what you're saying, that would also involve actually getting out, engaging with the communities, talking to communities. That is something that apparently, anecdotal, China does not yet do. In all fairness, I doubt that anyone gets out and leaves the camps in Mali. Right? I mean, it's probably true that the Chinese wouldn't want to do it, but who wants to go out in Mali? Chinese, the French special forces go out. Same in Afghanistan. It's very, very communal interaction and outreach. But it has been noted, as Susan said, it has been noted as one of the so as impressive China is today as a peacekeeper, that is one thing, and that's also what the Chinese perspective is. We're still lacking there, right? The other thing is, which I also find interesting, is that the things which are also needed in Mali, in terms of technology and in terms of capabilities and in terms of trainings, are the things that only a few powers have trained and learned in Afghanistan and Iraq. That is counterinsurgency environment. And you have to have the anti-IED technology. You have to have battlefield convoys. Only a few countries have that. Basically, the US, maybe the Brits a little bit. Right? So that is still lacking, but it also means that we have a totally different context today in Mali.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Rosanna. I'm a student at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. My question is, Professor Zürcher, if you found in your research any evidence of the developmental peace theory, or that China is trying to influence UN peacekeeping to become more like that, or is it just something that we should look forward to in the future?
Yeah, it's the latter. I think it's only just starting. I found maybe 3 academics who put forward this notion, and I was really surprised to find that the notion has been echoed now in this letter of confirmation. But I think it's in the beginning. What I do think, interesting enough, so to put it in context, right? Peacekeeping in China, within China, among academics, is not that important. It's a very small scene. It's I don't know, it's a dozen people, 15 people maybe, 15 academics who work on that. So it's not on the top priority, right? But this notion, I mean, it has certainly caught my attention for lots of reasons. Right? I think it's a really interesting notion. Part of the reason is, very quick one, part of the reason I find this interesting is there's a certain disappointment with the Western blueprint among scholars and academics. Right? It just does not work the way we think it would, maybe thought it would. It may work in easy cases, like Namibia or East Timor, when the national community is just, it's an easy case, so the peacekeeping mission can nudge that country towards democracy and works. It doesn't work in the difficult cases. It just does not. In the bottom billion in Afghanistan, Iraq, in Mali, it's not going to work, this approach, right? So there's a lot of on being not satisfied intellectually with that blueprint. And that is why this kind of development, illiberal peace, catches the attention of Western scholars like myself. And because we are interested, I think it will create a renewed interest among Chinese scholars. Because they kind of think it's, you know, it's interesting. And that would be one way to have a really interesting conversation about that. But to answer, okay, that was a long answer, but the short answer is no, it's just beginning, and it's not yet a theory, and it has not applied in practice. I mean, the only country is really China itself, right? Building up a country with a strong state, and the legitimacy comes from delivery of public services. But I think it's interesting. I'm intrigued.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. Merci à tout le monde. On a la réception en arrière. We have food and drinks, so enjoy and thank you very much, Christoph.
Thank you.